What's up, Vetters? Patrick here with Vetted. Lue Elizondo recently went on Dr. Phil's podcast. That's right, you heard me right, Dr. Phil, to make his case for why he thinks we're not alone. And Dr. Phil had some pretty general standard questions for him, but some of the answers Lue Elizondo gave were kind of interesting, especially when he revealed how we are gathering this information and what information we have about UFOs. You're going to want to hear this. So before we start, Vetters, please hit that like button. That really helps out the videos. And of course, please hit that subscribe button, y'all. I'm trying to get to 100,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Let's do this, Vetters. All right, I got two clips for you. Let's jump in to clip number one. Again, Lue Elizondo on Dr. Phil's podcast.
Does the government have alien technology, biological specimens? I mean, do they have stuff that is not of this planet? I mean, do they have things that there is no trail, no evidence, nothing that can be traced to anything that we know of on this planet? It doesn't mean that it might not be of this planet. We haven't discovered it yet, but somebody has. I mean, do they have this evidence and they're not sharing it with the public? Louis, what do you know that I don't know?
Sure. Well, let me, if I can, just as a disclaimer here, I still have my security clearance with the United States government. And so because of that, I am still held by my non-disclosure agreement. But what I can say is what I've been cleared to say by the Pentagon previously, and that is that the U.S. government is in possession of extremely exotic material of unknown origin. And I can also say, after, by the way, a year of a back and forth dialogue with the Pentagon, I can also say now, without getting into trouble, that biologics or biological specimens and samples were recovered from some of the crashes involving some of this very, very exotic technology. This conversation is dynamic. It's ongoing right now. There's a lot of people, both at the Pentagon and at the CIA and within our intelligence community, that are trying to figure out how to have this conversation with the American people. Why is that? It's because it's been over 70 years of misinformation that has been put out. And now the government finds itself in a situation where it has to basically unwind that tape. Despite telling the American people that there's nothing to see here, it turns out that there was quite a bit to see. And this sense of stigma and taboo, which, as you mentioned yourself, Phil, in the beginning, has tended to relegated this conversation to kind of the backwaters of fringe conspiracies. And it turned out that it's actually very, very true.
You know, I always get confused by the idea that someone who has a security clearance and who is bound by an NDA, right, can't talk about certain things. Totally makes sense. But then they can reveal that, we have recovered biologics and UFOs and they can reveal those details. The Pentagon's like, yeah, go ahead and tell people we got that stuff. Just don't tell them how we got. I mean, what? But then the Pentagon officially denies that we have any of that. So how is the Pentagon telling them it's okay to talk about that unless it's just not true, right? Otherwise, what? How does anyone, not just Lue Elizondo, how does anyone get around revealing that? Isn't that classified information in and of itself? Just the fact that we have that stuff, just saying we have it, isn't that classified? Right? Saying we have the craft, saying we have the bodies, right? I just don't get it. I can't wrap my head around that, right, at all. I've never heard a good answer from anybody either about that. Why that classified information is okay to reveal, but the details about it are not, right? Again, wouldn't just the fact that it exists be classified and you wouldn't be able to talk about it? Doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't know how I'm ever going to wrap my head around that, to be honest with you. But look, Lue Elizondo, as I'm going to show in this next clip, even reveals more things about how we gather information about these UAP. Again, wouldn't that be classified as well? I get he's not getting into the specifics of it, but just admitting that fact alone, right? Again, I'm not so sure. Take a look.
Louis, you're on the inside of this, and it's pretty clear without asking you to disclose anything that there is no doubt in your mind that we are not alone. Would that be a safe conclusion on my part?
It is, and it's not really, again, it's not world according to Lue, even if nobody, believe me, I really don't care. The reality is that the government has copious amounts of information and data. Let's look at it this way. You have you have eyewitness testimony from trained observers, people who can identify that and distinguish the difference between an Su-22 and a MiG-25 from 20 miles away, and make a split-second decision: do I shoot it or is it a friend? These are the best of the best Top Gun trained pilots that are seeing these things. Oh, by the way, it's being backed up by radar data, multiple phase arrays, and multiple different types of collection platforms. And oh, by the way, it's also being validated by gun camera footage and FLIR pod footage. So let's go back to the analogy of being in a courtroom. You now have five sources, independent sources of collection capabilities of information, all saying the same thing at the same time, at the same place, under the same circumstances. This is not just, oh, maybe someone mistaken ball lightning for something. That's not the case here. We're talking about a very real technology that we have seen come in over a controlled U.S. airspace time and time again, and has the ability to interfere with our nuclear equities. That is a fact. Now, if this was Russia or China, then I think I'd be even more scared, because for me, that's even a worst case scenario, because that means our intelligence apparatus is completely incompetent, which I don't think that's the case, because I have been in the intelligence community my entire career. It is very capable. And by the way, we forget that there's other type of space-based systems that we have access to as well that are also picking these things up. And it's not just in the electro-optical spectrum. There's other things like hyperspectral technology that can shed a lot of light on something if you know how to use those techniques and those capabilities.
All right. So what I found interesting was Lue Elizondo mentioning hyperspectral systems, right? Which I found to be very interesting as I looked into this, and I've got a couple clips to show you, so stay with me. But basically, I just want to explain what Lue Elizondo is talking about here, right? So it says space-based hyperspectral systems use satellites equipped with advanced sensors to capture detailed images of the Earth, revealing information beyond what's visible of the human eye. These systems capture a wide range of electromagnetic radiation, including visible and infrared light, allowing for the identification of specific chemicals and materials present on the surface. This technology is valuable for various applications, including environmental monitoring, disaster response, and resource management. Now, this is what's so interesting, is that it's the way that these systems capture information, because it's so different. And that's kind of interesting that we're capturing UAP in this particular way, right? So take a look at this clip. I'll put a link in the description so you can go watch the full interview if you want. But this is Tim Ventura interviewing Dr. Thomas Cooley, who is the chief scientist at the Air Force Research Laboratory Space Vehicles Directorate. Yeah, that's a mouthful. So anyway, let's hear him talk about these hyperspectral systems.
So in terms of the Air Force, some of the components of this have been around for a while, right? Like infrared imaging is in use in many aircraft. Radar imaging has been around since World War II.
Right.
So I guess is one of the biggest challenges in terms of this hyperspectral, the imaging spectroscopy, as you described it, is one of the biggest challenges the integration of these into kind of a single image. Is that kind of the challenge?
Yeah. Well, I think if we think about the history of remote sensing, and so I'm going to try and capture it in that term. We start with black and white imagery, right? Just your very basic camera. Then you have the advent of color. You're adding color to that, and of course, hyperspectral brings us to many colors that go outside of what your eye is sensitive to. Infrared, again, when you think about an infrared image, we're really looking at a heat map, typically of you can see a warm body against a cold background, that kind of a thing. And that's typically just, again, a single band. In other words, it's just a black and white image as it's portrayed in some sort of a media. What we're really talking about in terms of a hyperspectral image is more bands than you can display. So now the eye and the brain are not able to discern more than 3 primary colors, right? That's what this video screen is that I'm looking at now. It's 3 primary colors. And the eye and the brain have evolved to be very good at processing that. what we are able to do in a hyperspectral imager is there is some redundant information. In other words, we're collecting many bands between the range of the human eye. So we might have 10 or 15 color bands within that. So you're going to get various shades of green and blue and so forth, and we'll measure what the response is, what the incoming response is to the sensor. But what's more exciting is when you get outside of that, and if you think of the electromagnetic spectrum and some of the sensors that we talk about building, taking advantage of going into the ultraviolet through the visible spectrum where the eye is sensitive and into the infrared. And so you have near infrared, which a lot of times you might see, for example, vegetation is a very bright signature of reflectance in the near infrared. But as you go farther out, then you get more interesting and more subtle signatures.
Yeah, the images produced by hyperspectral imaging, or again, imaging spectroscopy, they're a little bit different than a traditional photograph, at least most of the time. I understand that these are represented primarily as these three-dimensional data cubes, and they're comprised of stacked images of the same scene from adjacent wavelengths. So the dimensions of this data cube are kind of built up from the satellite crosstrack and the wavelength range, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so this is one I found a couple of public domain images that I thought I would put out there for the audience. This is kind of another, these are both from the ESA. And again, these are what's called data cubes. And I guess as people go farther down them, as you go farther down that data grid, those colors would change. And it's because it's representing things that aren't visible to the human eye. And in this one, I guess you can see the intensity, and it's showing the wavelength as well.
All right, y'all. Again, links in the description. Go check it out for yourself. That full interview on Dr. Phil with Lue Elizondo, as well as Bryce Zabel, who is the podcast host with Ross Coulthart on the Need to Know podcast. It's a great conversation. I highly recommend going and checking that out. And of course, this interview that Tim Ventura did, it has under 1,000 views, and I highly recommend watching it. It's a little like inside baseball, but it's very interesting on these systems and how we're potentially capturing UAP, which makes sense that we're not capturing them on just standard systems. It kind of would make sense that we would need this more advanced system to potentially capture evidence that these UAP are flying around. So let me know what you think in the comments. We'll see you on the next video, vetters. Remember, every day's a gift, y'all. Peace.